Mary Whitlock's fingers had been locked around that broken banister for 3 hours when her knees finally gave. She didn't cry out. She had learned long ago that crying out changed nothing in a house like this. Her spine felt like a burning rod driven straight through her. Her vision blurred at the edges. And still 300 guests moved around her like she was furniture. She whispered it so quietly she wasn't sure she'd said it at all. "I can't stand anymore." And the room kept moving. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to this channel, follow Mary's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1814 came to Boston like a verdict. Hot, unforgiving, and impossible to argue with. The Graves estate sat at the top of Beacon Hill the way money always sits, elevated above everything it doesn't want to see. White columns, manicured gardens that had never known a single weed because there were always hands paid just enough to keep them invisible. 3 floors of imported wallpaper, French crystal chandeliers, and the particular silence that only very wealthy houses have, the kind of silence that costs people like Mary Whitlock everything to maintain. Mary had worked in that house for 4 years. 4 years of rising before the sun touched the windows. 4 years of pressing other women's silk gowns with hands that had never owned silk. 4 years of yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and of course, ma'am, until those 3 phrases had worn grooves so deep in her throat, she sometimes forgot she knew any other words. She was 23 years old, and she had learned to make herself small. Small enough to fit through doorways without being noticed. Small enough to carry a tea tray through a room full of Boston's finest without a single head turning. Small enough that when Eleanor Graves looked through her, not at her through her, Mary had learned to accept that as the natural order of things. Eleanor Graves had a way of looking at servants that was almost impressive in its precision. It was not cruelty exactly. Cruelty required acknowledging that the other person existed. What Eleanor practiced was something older and more efficient than cruelty. Erasure. Mary understood her place. She had understood it since the orphanage outside of Concord, where the matron had sat her down at age 9 and explained with great patience and no warmth that girls like Mary girls, without family names, without money, without anyone to speak for them, survived by being useful and caused trouble by wanting more. Mary had been useful for 14 years. She was good at it, which was exactly why Eleanor Graves had chosen her. The morning the banister broke had started like every other morning in the Graves household that summer. Mary had risen at 4:30, dressed in the gray uniform that had faded to something closer to ash after too many washings, and gone directly to the linen closet to collect the day's pressing order. Mrs. Harriet Plum, the head housekeeper, had already left the day's instructions pinned to the board in her particular cramped handwriting, a handwriting that looked, Mary had always thought, exactly like Mrs. Plum's personality. Tight. Economical. No space wasted on anything that wasn't strictly necessary. 3 gowns for Miss Graves, tea linens for the East Parlor, blue dress for the Widow Harmon's arrival. And this part was underlined twice: do not under any circumstances enter the study corridor before 9 o'clock. Mary had read that last line 3 times. She'd been working in this house long enough to know that instructions with double underlines were the ones that mattered most. And the ones that mattered most were always hiding something. She pressed the gowns. She starched the linens. She steamed the blue dress for the Widow Harmon, who would never arrive because the Widow Harmon, Mary would learn later, had been quietly told the invitation was a mistake. And then, just before 7 o'clock, she heard it. A sound from the study corridor. Low, rhythmic, like something being worked loose from its housing. She stood at the bottom of the main staircase and listened, and the sound stopped the moment she took a step toward it. She told herself it was the house settling. Old houses settled, especially in summer when the heat got into the wood and made it groan and shift like a living thing. She went back to work. She didn't go into the study corridor. The Grand Federal Charity Ball was Eleanor Graves's crowning achievement of every social season. 40 years of Boston society had taught Eleanor exactly what combination of performance and manipulation kept people in their proper places. The charity ball was the masterwork and annual event that raised money for war widows and orphaned children, while simultaneously allowing the city's elite to see and be seen, to establish hierarchies and settle scores, to be generous in ways that cost them nothing real. Eleanor Graves was celebrated for her generosity. She appeared in the papers. Ministers praised her from their pulpits. Women copied her hats and her charitable posture. And not one person in Boston had ever thought to look at the ledgers. Mary had. She hadn't meant to. She had been delivering pressed correspondence to the East Study on the morning of the ball 3 weeks ago now, though it felt like 100 years, and the ledger had been open on the desk. Not hidden. Just sitting there the way things sit when the person who left them there is very confident that no one who matters will ever look at them. Mary had looked at it because she was by nature someone who noticed things that weren't meant to be noticed. Numbers, columns, names she recognized, and numbers that didn't match the public accounts she'd overheard Eleanor reciting at the parlor charity committee meetings. The War Widow Fund, the Orphan Relief Accounts, the Federal Relief Society quarterly disbursements. The sums were wrong, not slightly wrong. Not the kind of wrong that came from honest mistakes in arithmetic. The kind of wrong that had been very carefully constructed to look almost right. Mary had stood there for 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds, her entire understanding of her situation had rearranged itself into something much more dangerous than she'd bargained for. She had memorized as much as she could before footsteps in the corridor sent her out of the room with her stack of correspondence and her face arranged into the careful blankness she'd spent 14 years perfecting. She'd spent 3 weeks trying to decide what to do with what she'd seen. She was still deciding when she walked up the main staircase on the morning of the ball. The step gave way under her left foot without any warning at all. So, she had grabbed the banister on pure instinct. The wood had held barely. Her left ankle had twisted as her foot dropped through the rotted step, and she'd wrenched her shoulder. Catching herself, and she'd stood there for a full minute in the empty stairwell, breathing hard, her heart slamming against her ribs, waiting for someone to appear. No one came. She'd pulled her foot free of the broken step carefully. She'd tested her weight. Her ankle screamed, but it held. She'd climbed the rest of the stairs, gripping the banister with both hands, not trusting a single board beneath her feet. And she'd gone directly to Mrs. Plum's door and knocked. Mrs. Plum had opened the door in her cap and dressing gown, her face arranged in the expression it always wore, somewhere between disapproval and controlled impatience. "The step is broken," Mary said. "Third from the bottom. It gave way and I nearly fell." Mrs. Plum had looked at her for a long moment. "Third from the bottom has always been slightly uneven," she said. "Mind where you step." "Ma'am, I'm telling you it's broken. My foot went through. Someone needs to repair it before the ball tonight, or a guest could be seriously hurt." Something shifted in Mrs. Plum's expression, something Mary couldn't quite read. "I'll have someone look at it," Mrs. Plum said, and closed the door. No one looked at it. Mary checked 3 times before the guests began arriving. The step sat there like a quiet promise, and by 6:30, when the carriages began rolling up the drive, and the front hall filled with Boston's finest in their summer silks and their Federal-era finery, the gentlemen in their high collars and dark coats, the ladies in their pale muslins with their gloves and their careful smiles, the step was still broken, still rotting from the inside, still waiting. Eleanor Graves stood at the entrance to the grand hall, as though she had grown there, as though the house had built itself around her, rather than the other way around. She wore ivory silk. She wore the Graves family rubies at her throat. She wore the expression of a woman who had organized the world exactly to her liking and found it satisfactory. Her son Jonathan stood to her left. Jonathan Graves was 31 years old and had the kind of face that looked at first glance like what people meant when they said a well-bred gentleman. Regular features, good height, the practiced ease of a man who had never once needed to consider how he appeared to others, because he had always appeared correctly. He had his mother's eyes, pale gray, precise, capable of being warm for exactly as long as warmth was useful. He had been watching Mary for 3 weeks. Not openly. He wasn't careless. But she had felt it the way you feel weather changing before you can see the clouds. The way he appeared in rooms she was working in, always with a perfectly reasonable explanation for his presence, always managing to leave her with the distinct impression that the explanation was theater. She had tried to stay out of his path. She had nearly succeeded. Eleanor found her at 7:30 in the corridor behind the east parlor, carrying a tray of clean linens for the upstairs rooms. "Mary." She stopped. Eleanor's voice was the same voice it always was, unhurried, pleasant, with the particular texture of silk over iron. The voice of a woman who had never once in her life needed to raise it to get what she wanted. "Yes, ma'am. I need you in the grand hall tonight, near the east entrance. You'll stand with the other girls during the presentation of the charity accounts." Mary felt something cold move through her. "Ma'am, it's a tradition," Eleanor said with a smile that had been calibrated to perfection by 40 years of practice. "We present the staff who have contributed to the charity work. It's an expression of gratitude. You'll stand near the east entrance and represent the seamstress staff. You'll wear the gray uniform." The gray uniform, not one of the nicer presentation dresses that some houses gave their staff for formal occasions. The gray uniform, the faded, washed-out gray that made a person look like part of the wall. "Of course, ma'am," Mary said. Eleanor nodded, already half turned away. "Oh," she said, as though it had just occurred to her. "And Mary, you'll need to stand still, the entire time. It's a formal presentation. No moving about. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am," Mary said. She stood for 3 hours. She stood while the speeches were made, and the crystal was raised, and Eleanor Graves received the applause of 300 people who believed everything she told them. She stood while the musicians played, and the couples danced, and the candles burned lower in their holders, and the summer heat pressed down through the tall windows until the grand hall felt like the inside of a glove. Her ankle, which had never been seen to after the morning's fall, had begun to stiffen by the second hour. By the third hour, it was something beyond stiffening. It was a deep, grinding burn that started in the joint and radiated upward through her calf and downward into her foot. She had stopped being able to feel her toes sometime around 9 o'clock. She stood still. Because Eleanor had told her to stand still, she held herself upright through sheer arithmetic. Counting breaths, counting heartbeats, counting the seconds between the moments when the pain peaked and then mercifully plateaued into something she could manage if she didn't think about it too directly. Don't think about it. Count. Breathe. Don't let your face change. She was good at not letting her face change. She had been practicing that particular skill since she was 9 years old. Around 10 o'clock, her left hand found the edge of the banister at the east entrance. Not for support, not yet. Just for orientation. Just to have something real and solid to hold on to while the room swam slightly at the edges. Her fingers tightened around the wood. "I can get through this. I have gotten through worse than this. I can stand here until the last guest leaves, and I can climb back up the stairs, and I can." Her knee buckled, just slightly, just for a half second. Her body's involuntary admission that it had reached some internal limit that Mary hadn't been consulted about. And that was when it came out of her. Not a cry, not a shout. Something much smaller and much more honest than either of those things, a whisper that her body produced without her permission, the way a crack produces sound before a board gives way. "I can't stand anymore." It was barely a breath, but the room was quiet enough just then between songs, and she was standing near enough to the center of the gathered society of Boston that it carried. 300 people heard it. 300 people in their ivory silk and their rubies and their Federal-era finery, with their charity accounts and their applause and their well-practiced expressions of compassion, heard a 23-year-old woman whisper that she could not stand anymore. And not one of them moved. Not one head turned fully. Not one glass was set down. Not one pair of gloved hands reached toward her. The musicians, after a brief pause that lasted just long enough to register as acknowledgement, resumed playing. Mary locked her jaw. She found her breath again. She pressed her hand harder into the banister, and she made herself straight, and she looked at the middle distance the way she had learned to look at nothing, at everything at the particular point where you weren't looking at anyone, because looking at anyone meant existing in their field of vision. And that was not her function tonight. Her function tonight was to stand. She stood. She didn't see him come in. She didn't see him cross the room. She was focused entirely on the arithmetic of breathing and the question of whether her ankle was about to give her no choice in the matter when the room changed. Not in any obvious way. Not with a shout or a disturbance. The room changed the way air changes before lightning, a subtle shift in pressure, a collective intake of breath that you didn't consciously register until after it had already happened. She looked up. He was standing 6 feet away from her. She didn't know him. She had never seen him before tonight, and yet something about him registered immediately as different from every other man in this room. He was perhaps 40, dark-haired, dressed in the severe federal style that some judges and federal officers favored, nothing decorative, nothing unnecessary. His face was the kind of face that did not arrange itself easily into pleasantness. It was a face built for assessment, for precision, for the particular kind of attention that saw things as they actually were, rather than as it was convenient for them to be. He was looking at her, not through her, at her. Mary watched him take in her hand on the banister, her locked jaw, the way she was holding herself upright, with the particular rigidity of someone who is running purely on will. She watched him see it all, not with pity, not with the comfortable sympathy that allowed people to feel something without doing anything, but with something colder and more useful than sympathy. Comprehension. He took 3 steps toward her, and the crowd parted for him, in the way crowds parted for certain kinds of men, not because he demanded it, but because something in his bearing communicated that he was going to pass through, whether they moved or not, and moving was simply the more efficient response. He stopped in front of her. "You're injured," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low. Not gentle exactly. Gentleness would have been a kind of condescension. It was direct. It was the voice of a man accustomed to stating observable facts and proceeding from there. Mary's jaw tightened. "I'm fine, sir," she said. "You are not fine," he said. "Your left leg has been compensating for approximately 2 hours. The joint is compromised. How did you injure it?" The room had gone very quiet around them. She was aware, acutely, painfully aware of every pair of eyes now pointed in their direction. Of Eleanor Graves, standing 20 feet away, her expression perfectly composed, but her eyes fixed on this exchange with the particular intensity of a person calculating. "A step," Mary said carefully. "This morning. I misjudged it." "Which step?" "It doesn't matter, sir. I beg your pardon, I don't know who you are." "My name is Nathaniel Hawthorne," he said. "I am a federal circuit judge, and I am asking which step Miss Whitlock," she said. "Mary Whitlock." He said her name once quietly, as though recording it somewhere internal. "Miss Whitlock, which step?" She looked at him. She looked at Eleanor Graves, whose expression had not changed, but whose hands Mary noticed had gone very still at her sides. She looked back at Judge Hawthorne, and for the first time in 4 years in this house, for the first time, if she was honest in her entire adult life, someone was looking at her as though her answer was going to matter. "The 3rd step from the bottom," she said. "On the main staircase. The wood was rotted through. I reported it this morning. No one repaired it." Something moved through his eyes. Not surprise. Something harder and more deliberate than surprise. "When you say you reported it," he said, "to whom did you report it?" The silence in the room had gone from ordinary quiet to the particular quality of held breath. "To Mrs. Plum," Mary said. "The housekeeper." And Mrs. Plum's response. Mary looked at him steadily. "She told me to mind where I step, sir." Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne turned then very slowly and looked at Eleanor Graves. Eleanor Graves looked back at him with 40 years of Boston confidence and the particular composure of a woman who had never yet been held accountable for anything. The musicians had stopped playing. The candles burned. The summer heat pressed against the windows, and the grand hall of Graves' estate with its 300 guests and its federal charity accounts, and its ivory silk and its rubies, waited for someone to decide what happened next. The silence in that grand hall did not break all at once. It unraveled. Thread by thread, the way expensive fabric comes apart when one wrong stitch gives way slowly at first, then faster than anyone can stop it. Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne had not moved. He stood between Mary Whitlock and Eleanor Graves, like a man who had planted himself in that particular spot and intended to remain there until the matter was resolved to his satisfaction. His hands were clasped behind his back. His expression had not changed. He looked, Mary thought, like a man who was accustomed to rooms that did not know what to do with him. Eleanor Graves recovered first. She always recovered first. 40 years of Boston society had given her a recovery reflex, so finely tuned it was practically instinct. "Judge Hawthorne," she said, stepping forward with the gracious precision of a woman greeting an honored guest, rather than a woman being publicly scrutinized. "What an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware you'd accepted the invitation." "I was in the city on federal business," he said. "A colleague suggested I attend. I regret I was not here earlier in the evening." The last sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went outward instantly. Mary felt the collective recalculation happening around her 300 guests, quietly updating their assessments of the situation. Eleanor's smile held. "We're delighted to have you regardless. I hope you'll allow me to introduce you to some of our most generous supporters." "In a moment," he said. Just that. 2 words, perfectly flat, perfectly final. Not rude. Simply immovable. Eleanor's smile flickered so briefly that anyone who wasn't watching for it would have missed it entirely. Mary was watching for it. "This young woman," Hawthorne said, "has been standing on an injured leg for the better part of 3 hours. I would like someone to bring a chair." No one moved. This was the thing about rooms like this. Mary had learned rooms full of people who had spent their entire lives watching other people for social cues. Nobody wanted to be the first. Being the first meant committing to a side before the sides had fully declared themselves. Hawthorne turned his head slightly and looked at the nearest footman, a young man named Thomas who Mary had worked alongside for 2 years, who was currently staring at the middle distance, with the expression of someone who desperately wished he were somewhere else. "You," Hawthorne said. "Bring a chair." Thomas moved so fast he nearly knocked over the tray stand behind him. "That's entirely unnecessary," Eleanor said. Her voice had gained an edge, just barely perceptible, just enough to let the room know she was paying attention. "Mary is perfectly fine. Aren't you, Mary?" It was not a question. Mary knew that tone. She had been hearing that tone for 4 years. It was the tone that meant, "You will agree with me, and you will do it now, and you will do it convincingly, because the alternative is a conversation you cannot afford to have." She had always agreed before, every single time. She opened her mouth, and Thomas arrived with the chair. Hawthorne stepped aside and gestured toward it, with a slight inclination of his head, not performative, not gallant in the theatrical way some men were gallant. Simply practical. The way a man points to a door. Mary sat down. The sound that her ankle made the relief of weight removed from that joint was something she felt in her back teeth. She pressed her lips together and breathed through it, and she did not look at Eleanor Graves, because she knew exactly what she would see on Eleanor's face if she did. She was instructed to stand for the presentation, Eleanor said, and now there was a slight brightness to her voice, the brightness of a woman reframing. "It's a tradition. Our staff participates in the charity presentation as a mark of honor. I'm sure you understand the protocol, Judge." "Which presentation?" he said. "I beg your pardon. The charity presentation. Which accounts were presented tonight?" Eleanor blinked. It was a small blink, controlled, but it was the first thing she'd done all evening that looked even faintly like surprise. "The usual quarterly accounts," she said. "The Federal Relief Society, the War Widow Fund, the Orphan Relief. And the figures match the federal disbursement records." The room had gone very, very still. Eleanor Graves looked at Nathaniel Hawthorne, and for just a moment, One moment, beneath all the ivory silk and the rubies and the 40 years of impeccable composure, something moved across her face that Mary recognized. Fear. "I'm certain they do," Eleanor said. "They always do. We run a very careful operation here, Judge Hawthorne. I would be happy to have our accounts reviewed at any time." "Good," he said. "I'll arrange that." He arranged for Mary to be seen by a physician before the evening was out. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to make his point and move on, the way powerful men made points as demonstrations and then returned to their own concerns. But he stayed. He spoke quietly to one of the other guests, a Dr. Cornelius Webb, who moved through the remaining crowd with the apologetic efficiency of a man being called away from his supper, and within 20 minutes, Mary was sitting in the small anteroom off the east corridor, while Dr. Webb examined her ankle with professional thoroughness and the slight frown of a man who was finding more than he anticipated. "How long ago did this happen?" he asked without looking up. "This morning," she said. "Around 6:30. He did look up then. "You've been on this for nearly 16 hours. "I had work to do." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back down at her ankle, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. "It's not broken," he said finally. "Severely sprained. The ligament is stressed. You'll need to stay off it for at least 2 weeks. "I can't stay off it for 2 weeks. "Miss Whitlock, I have a position here. I have rent. 2 weeks off my feet means 2 weeks without wages, which means—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. "Thank you for seeing to it, Dr. Webb. I'm grateful for your time." He wrapped it carefully and said nothing more. But when he left the room, he left it with the expression of a man who had seen something that was going to stay with him. Hawthorne was waiting in the corridor. Mary came out on a borrowed cane, one of the house's decorative walking sticks that she was fairly certain Mrs. Plum would have opinions about, and found him standing exactly where she'd expected him to be. Not pacing, not consulting his watch, simply standing there the way he seemed to do everything, with a kind of absolute unhurried certainty about his own presence in a space. "The physician's assessment," he said. "Severe sprain. It'll heal. 2 weeks at minimum, I'd expect." "So he said." Hawthorne looked at her. "And you intend to be back on your feet tomorrow morning?" It wasn't a judgment. It wasn't even quite a question. It was the same thing he'd been doing all evening, stating observable facts. "I intend to keep my position," she said, "which amounts to the same thing." A pause. "Miss Whitlock," he said, and something in his voice had changed, not softer exactly, but with a different quality of attention to it. "What you said in the hall tonight, about the step." Her chest tightened. "Yes, sir." "You reported it, this morning, and it was not repaired." "That's correct." "In your estimation," he said carefully, "was that an oversight or a decision?" Mary looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was empty. The sounds of the party drifted from the other end of the house, a muffled remnant of music voices, the clink of crystal. The candles in the wall sconces had burned lower, and the light was warmer and less forgiving than the chandelier brightness of the grand hall. And in that light, Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne looked less like a man performing authority and more like a man who was actually paying attention. She had not told anyone about the ledger. She had carried it for 3 weeks. That knowledge carried it the way you carry something sharp and heavy, carefully making sure it didn't cut through the container you were keeping it in. She had not told anyone because she did not know who to tell. She did not have a father or a husband or a brother or a solicitor or anyone who existed in the kind of social register that made accusations possible. She was an orphan seamstress with a faded gray uniform and a rented room on Charter Street, and the people she might accuse owned half of Boston's charitable infrastructure and had the personal friendship of judges and ministers and judges. "Miss Whitlock," Hawthorne said again, quieter now, "I am asking you a direct question. I would like a direct answer." She made a decision. She made it the way she'd made most of the important decisions of her life, quickly, without the luxury of adequate information, betting everything on the only thing she had to bet with, which was her own judgment. I don't think it was an oversight, she said. He waited. I think there are people in this house who would benefit from me not being able to walk, she said. Or speak, or remain employed. Hawthorne was very still. And why, he said, would that be? She told him about the ledger, not all of it. Not the specific figures. She'd had 3 weeks to run those numbers in her head, but she wasn't foolish enough to recite them from memory in a corridor where anyone could appear around a corner. She told him what she'd seen, what she'd recognized. The discrepancy between the accounts Eleanor presented publicly and the figures she'd seen in that open book on the study desk. She watched his face as she talked. It didn't change. She was beginning to understand simply how his face worked. It processed information without broadcasting it the way a mill processes grain. You couldn't see the mechanism. You could only observe what came out the other side. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks ago, he said. Yes. And in those 3 weeks you've told no one. Oh, who would I tell? She said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Tell me the name of one person in this city I could walk up to and say Eleanor Graves has been stealing from the War Widow Fund, and have them believe me instead of her. I'll wait. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not a smile. You'd have needed the ledger itself, he said. I know that. Do you know where it's kept? The East Study, bottom drawer of the correspondence desk. But I haven't been able to get back in there. Jonathan has been keeping a very close eye on my movements since... She stopped. Hawthorne's attention sharpened visibly perceptibly, like a lens coming into focus. Jonathan, he said. Eleanor's son. Yes. What kind of close eye? Mary pressed her lips together. How to describe the feeling of being watched by Jonathan Graves in a way that was accurate without being melodramatic, in a way that conveyed the reality of it without sounding like the kind of complaint a young woman made when she wanted to be taken seriously and wasn't. He appears in rooms I'm working in, she said. With explanations, always with explanations. Last Tuesday he came to the pressing room at 7 a.m. to tell me that a button had come loose on one of his coats. He stood there for 20 minutes while I sewed it. And before he left, she met Hawthorne's eyes. He told me I was very talented with my hands, and that it would be a shame for something to happen to them. The corridor was very quiet. Those were his exact words, Hawthorne said. Yes, sir. And you took it as a threat. I took it as a man who is accustomed to not needing to be explicit, she said, because the women in his life have always understood him perfectly the first time. Another pause. Longer. Miss Whitlock, Hawthorne said. I need you to understand something. What you're describing, if it's accurate, and I have reason to believe it may be, is not a matter of a household dispute. This is federal charity money. War widows. Orphans. If the accounts have been falsified, that is a federal crime. And the evidence to prove it needs to be obtained correctly, or it will be useless. I understand that, which means I cannot simply walk into the East Study and take the ledger. Not tonight. Not without grounds. I understand that too, she said. I've had 3 weeks to understand it. He looked at her. You've been waiting for someone with grounds. I've been waiting for someone with grounds who might actually use them, she said. Sir. Eleanor found her the next morning. Mary had not slept. She'd sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' quarters until the sky outside the window went from black to deep blue to the particular gray of early summer morning, and she'd gone through everything she'd said in that corridor, word by word, like a woman checking stitches in a seam she wasn't sure would hold. She'd been at her pressing board for an hour when Eleanor came in. Eleanor never came to the pressing room. In 4 years, she'd sent instructions through Mrs. Plum, through notes, through the complicated hierarchy of the household that kept certain people at certain distances from each other. Coming to the pressing room personally was a statement. Mary set down the iron. Good morning, ma'am. Eleanor looked at her ankle at the wrapping at the borrowed cane, leaning against the pressing board with an expression of careful concern that sat on her face the way paint sat on old wood, smooth on the surface, hiding everything underneath. "You should be resting," Eleanor said. "I'm managing fine, ma'am." "I insist." Eleanor moved into the room and closed the door behind her, another first in 4 years. "Mary, I want you to know that I'm deeply troubled by what happened last evening. The step, your injury. Mrs. Plum has been spoken to very firmly." "Thank you, ma'am." "And I want to assure you that your position here is completely secure. You've been an exemplary member of this household." Mary looked at her. 4 years. 4 years of Eleanor Graves's face in various configurations, pleased-displeased, performing graciousness, performing concern. She knew this face. She knew every shade of it. This was the face Eleanor wore when she was managing something. "I appreciate that, ma'am," Mary said. "Judge Hawthorne," Eleanor said, her voice dropping just slightly, not to a whisper, but to the particular register that meant this part of the conversation is between us. "Is a thorough man. He has a reputation for it. I imagine he asked you a great many questions last night." "He was very kind," Mary said. "He ensured I was seen by a physician." "Yes." A pause. "I hope you were able to convey to him that the household takes every possible care of its staff." Mary held Eleanor's gaze. "I told him exactly what happened, ma'am," she said, "as I understood it." Eleanor's smile remained perfectly positioned on her face. "Of course. That's all anyone can do." She moved toward the door and then stopped, that theatrical, almost afterthought that Mary had seen her deploy 100 times always when the actual point of the conversation was about to be made. "Jonathan was asking after you this morning, by the way. He's very concerned about your ankle." Mary said nothing. "He mentioned—" Eleanor continued studying a seam in the wallpaper with apparent interest. "That he'd noticed you've seemed troubled lately, distracted. He thought perhaps you might benefit from a change of duties, something less physically demanding." Something less physically demanding. Less access to the house. Less access to the study corridor. "I wouldn't want to be any trouble," Mary said. "It's no trouble at all." Eleanor's hand was on the door. "We want what's best for you, Mary. We always have." She left. Mary stood at her pressing board for a full minute after the door closed, her hands flat on the cool surface of it, breathing slowly and steadily. Then she picked up the iron. Samuel Briggs came to find her at noon. Samuel was the estate's head coachman, a compact, weathered man of 55 who had worked for the Graves family for 23 years, and had over those 23 years developed the particular relationship with truth that long service to a dishonest employer tends to produce. He knew things. He kept them to himself. He had, in Mary's experience, a finely calibrated sense of when keeping things to himself had become more dangerous than the alternative. He appeared at the side entrance of the pressing room, with his hat in his hands and a look on his face like a man who'd been working himself up to something for a while. "Miss Whitlock." "Mr. Briggs." He looked at her ankle, then at her face, then at the closed door behind him. "I heard what happened last night," he said, "with the judge. Word travels fast. In this house it does." He turned his hat over in his hands twice. "There's something I should have said a long time ago." Mary set down the iron. "That step," he said. "The third one from the bottom." She waited. "I was asked to loosen it," he said. "2 nights ago, by Mr. Jonathan. He said it was a repair job, that the carpenter had already looked at it and said it needed the old bracket removed before the new one could go in. He said he'd have the carpenter back the next day." He paused. The carpenter never came. The room was very quiet. "Mr. Briggs," Mary said carefully, "are you telling me that step was deliberately made unsafe?" He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His hands had gone still on the hat brim. "I'm telling you what I was told and what I did, and what didn't happen next. I'll let you draw your own conclusions." "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because last night when I saw you in that hall, He stopped. Started again. I have a daughter your age, he said. She works in a house over in Cambridge, and when I saw you standing there Another stop. I should have come to you the morning after I loosened it. I didn't. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it was probably exactly what Jonathan said it was. He looked at his hat. I've been telling myself things weren't my business for a long time, Miss Whitlock. I'm tired of it. Mary looked at him for a long moment. If I asked you to repeat what you just told me, she said, to someone with federal authority, would you do it? Samuel Briggs was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Boston summer moved in its ordinary morning rhythms. Carriages on the cobblestones, voices the distant bell from the Old North Church marking the quarter hour. Life proceeding as life did, indifferent to the things happening in pressing rooms and servant corridors, and the spaces where people who didn't count were quietly working out whether they had the courage to count themselves. Yes, he said finally. I reckon I would. Jonathan found her that afternoon. She had known he would. The conversation with Eleanor had been a preliminary, the soft approach the velvet version of the message. Jonathan was the version that came after the velvet when the velvet hadn't worked. He appeared in the doorway of the linen closet while she was sorting the afternoon's inventory, and he stood there with his shoulder against the frame in a posture that was designed to look casual and achieved something closer to a block. Mary, he said, how's the ankle? Better, thank you, Mr. Graves. He looked at the cane. You shouldn't be working. You should be resting. The echo of Eleanor's words in his mouth was so precise, it was almost impressive. I'll speak to Mrs. Plum. Have someone cover your duties for the week. That's not necessary. I insist. She kept her hands moving through the linen inventory, counted sheets, counted her breaths, kept her face exactly where she needed it to be. Last night, he said, and his voice dropped not to softness to something with a different quality to it. You had quite a conversation with Judge Hawthorne. He was very attentive, she said. I was grateful for his concern. What did you talk about? My ankle mostly. Mostly, he repeated. She looked up and met his eyes. This was the thing about Jonathan Graves that was different from his mother. Eleanor was precision calculation control. Jonathan was those things too, but underneath them there was something that Eleanor had trained out of herself entirely. Something impatient, something that wanted. I don't recall the specifics, Mary said. I was in a good deal of pain. He held her gaze. Of course. A beat. The thing about men like Hawthorne, he said, is that they're very thorough, very procedural. They can't act on anything without evidence, without proper documentation, without witnesses willing to come forward and make formal statements. He straightened from the doorframe. Which in a situation that amounts to one servant's word against a family with 40 years of reputation in this city, tends to be difficult to come by. Mary said nothing. I just want you to understand the reality of the situation, he said, pleasantly. I think you're a very capable young woman, Mary. I always have. I'd hate for you to find yourself in a difficult position because you'd misjudged how something looked from the outside. He left. She stood in the linen closet with her hands full of sheets and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her damaged ankle, and she breathed, counted, steadied herself against the shelving with one hand. Then she went to find Samuel Briggs, and she told him it was time. She got the ledger that evening. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks, and in the end, the method was simpler than she'd imagined. Not through cleverness, not through risk, but through the particular invisibility that had been the defining feature of her life in this house. She was a seamstress. She was sent to the study corridor to collect a coat for repair, a task so routine that no one logged it, no one watched for it. She walked into the east study in plain view of the household's ordinary evening rhythms, and she opened the bottom drawer of the correspondence desk, and the ledger was exactly where it had been 3 weeks ago. She didn't take it, she copied it. She had been planning this for 3 weeks, had purchased a small notebook from a stationer on Washington Street with a week's saved wages, and kept it pressed flat inside her bodice every day since. She sat at that desk for 12 minutes in the last gray light of the summer evening, and she copied every figure she could, every account number, every disbursement, every sum that didn't match the public record in the small, precise handwriting that she'd taught herself at the orphanage, borrowing books from the parish library, and practicing letters on the backs of discarded correspondence. 12 minutes. She was out of the room and back in the pressing corridor before the clock struck 7. Her hands were shaking. Her ankle was burning. Her heart was entirely steady. She had what she needed. Now she needed to get it to the one man in Boston who had both the authority to use it and the demonstrated willingness to try. She wrote a note that night in her narrow bed by the stub of a candle she couldn't really afford. She wrote it carefully with no names. Nothing that could be turned against her if it was intercepted. Just figures and a request, and at the bottom in the same small, precise handwriting, I am not asking for rescue. I am asking for a fair hearing. I believe you are the kind of man who knows the difference. She sealed it with the stub of wax from the candle end, and in the morning she gave it to Samuel Briggs, and she went back to work. Because that was what she did. She worked and she waited, and she kept her face exactly where it needed to be, and she counted her breaths, and she pressed other women's gowns with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and she held everything she knew inside her like a coal held in cupped palms. Burning, patient, ready. Samuel Briggs delivered the note on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday evening, Mary had received no response. She told herself that was expected. A federal judge did not rearrange his schedule around a letter from a seamstress. He had courts to attend, cases to manage, a city's worth of legitimate business to conduct. He had no obligation to her whatsoever beyond what he had already done, which was more than anyone else in Boston had managed in 4 years. She pressed gowns. She sorted linen. She kept her face where it needed to be. By Thursday, Jonathan had stopped appearing in rooms she was working in. That frightened her more than the watching had. A man who was watching you was a man who was still deciding. A man who had stopped watching had already decided and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. She started keeping the copied ledger pages inside her bodice at all times, even sleeping. Even when the folded paper pressed against her ribs hard enough to leave marks on her skin by morning. She wasn't leaving it anywhere in the house that Jonathan's hands could reach. Friday morning, Mrs. Plum reassigned her, not to lighter duties, as Jonathan had suggested, to the laundry room, the hottest, most physically demanding work in the house, and the furthest from the study corridor, the east parlor, the rooms where information lived. It was done with a pleasant explanation about her ankle, needing less stair work, delivered in Mrs. Plum's cramped economical voice, with her cramped economical expression, and Mary had accepted it with yes ma'am, and gone directly to the laundry room and lifted heavy wet linens for 6 hours on a sprained ankle that was not yet 2 weeks healed. She didn't complain. She counted. She breathed. And on Friday evening, when she came back to her room with her hands raw and her ankle screaming and her back aching in ways she was fairly sure it wouldn't stop aching for a week, she found a folded note slipped under her door. No seal, no name. Just 4 words in a handwriting she didn't recognize, precise, angular, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life writing things that needed to be exactly right. Thursday next. Be ready. She read it 3 times. Then she held it over her candle and burned it. She did not know what be ready meant in practical terms for a federal judge operating within the boundaries of the law. She knew what it meant for her. It meant that whatever was coming, she could not afford to be caught with the ledger copies before it arrived. She needed those pages intact and in her possession, and she needed Jonathan Graves to not know they existed until it was too late to do anything about it. It also meant she needed to talk to Samuel Briggs again. She found him at the carriage house on Saturday morning under the pretext of asking him to carry a trunk to the upper storage, the kind of errand that happened routinely that no one tracked. He listened to what she told him with the stillness of a man who had made his decision and was past the part where he second-guessed it. Thursday, he said. Thursday. He turned that over. What do you need from me? I need you to be willing to say what you told me, she said. About the step. About Jonathan's instructions. In front of whoever needs to hear it. I said I would. I know. I'm asking again because I need you to be certain. Once this starts moving, Mr. Briggs, it doesn't stop. And the Graves family has had 23 years to build what they have in this city. What's coming for them is going to come hard. And anyone standing on our side of it is going to feel that. Samuel Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Miss Whitlock, he said, my wages from this house have paid my daughter's schooling and my wife's doctor bills and the rent on our house for 23 years. Eleanor Graves held that over me every single day without ever once saying it out loud. She didn't need to. He paused. I am 63 years old. I am tired of being held. Mary nodded. Thursday, she said. Thursday. He agreed. Sunday arrived with the particular heavy heat of a Boston summer that had decided to make a point. Mary was crossing the upper hallway with a stack of pressed linens when she nearly walked directly into Jonathan Graves. He didn't step aside. She did automatically, reflexively, the way 4 years of training moved her body before her mind could intervene. She stepped to the right and flattened herself slightly against the wall and said, "Pardon me, Mr. Graves." In the even voice she'd practiced so long, it came out the same regardless of what was happening behind it. Jonathan looked at her stack of linens, then at her face. "How's the ankle?" he said. "Much improved, thank you. Good." A pause. "You seem better. More yourself." He tilted his head. "I was a little worried after last week. You seemed tense." "I'm perfectly well, Mr. Graves." "Glad to hear it." He didn't move. Judge Hawthorne left the city, by the way. Did you know that federal business in Philadelphia? He won't be back for several weeks at least. Mary kept her face exactly where it needed to be. "I wasn't aware of his schedule," she said. "No, of course not. Why would you be?" He smiled, and it was a good smile technically. Constructed correctly. All the right muscles in the right positions. "I just thought you might like to know, in case you'd been expecting anything." He stepped aside then finally and let her pass. She walked the remaining length of the hallway with even steps. Her hands steady on the linen stack, her ankle protesting each footfall with a dull insistence she'd gotten good at ignoring. She went into the linen closet and put the stack down on the shelf, and stood there alone in the small, warm space, and let herself feel it for exactly 30 seconds. The cold, plummeting drop of that information, the way it rearranged everything she'd been holding herself together around for the past 6 days. He's gone. He's not coming Thursday. He was never coming Thursday. The note was what? A mistake. A misunderstanding. Something she'd misread in 4 words from a man she'd met once in a corridor, 30 seconds. Then she picked up the next stack of linens and went back to work, because she had learned something over 14 years of being a person who wasn't supposed to matter. And it was this, the moment you stopped working, was the moment they won. And she had not come this far, had not carried this knowledge for 3 weeks, had not sat at that desk for 12 stolen minutes, had not burned that note over a candle stub, had not held herself upright for 3 hours in a grand hall while 300 people decided she didn't exist to let Jonathan Graves's smile be the last word on the subject. She was not done. Monday passed. Tuesday passed. Wednesday morning, the Graves household received formal notification of a federal circuit court inquiry into the charitable accounts of the Federal Relief Society of Boston, to be conducted under the authority of the Honorable Judge Nathaniel Hawthorne, commencing the following Thursday. Mrs. Plum read the notification aloud at the household morning assembly with the expression of a woman who was keeping everything she was actually thinking very tightly behind her teeth. Jonathan Graves did not attend the morning assembly. Eleanor Graves did. She stood at the head of the room in her morning dress, and she listened to Mrs. Plum read every word of that notification, and her face did not change at all. Not even the small flicker Mary had caught in the grand hall. It was as though the document had been read in a foreign language, in a room she wasn't particularly interested in about people she didn't know. It was the most frightening thing Mary had ever seen her do. After the assembly dismissed, Eleanor looked across the room and found Mary's eyes. She held them for 3 seconds, Then she turned and walked away. He came back Wednesday evening. Mary knew because Samuel Briggs told her he'd been asked to collect a passenger from the federal offices on Court Street, and the passenger was Judge Hawthorne, and he'd ridden in silence the entire way back to the inn on Tremont Street, where he'd apparently been staying since last week, saying nothing except a quiet thank you when he stepped down from the carriage. Jonathan had lied. He hadn't gone to Philadelphia. He had been in Boston the entire time, moving pieces she couldn't see, and she had spent 4 days thinking she'd been abandoned, when in fact she'd been protected. The inquiry notification had been filed before Jonathan told her Hawthorne had left. He had already known it was coming. He had told her that lie to see what she'd do with it, to see if she'd panic, make a mistake, try to run or hide or reach out in some traceable way that would give him what he needed to discredit her. She'd gone back to work. She understood now with a clarity that felt almost physical that this was what her life had actually trained her for. Not servitude, not endurance for its own sake, but this, the ability to hold still under pressure, to go on functioning, to give nothing away when everything in you wanted to break. She had been practicing for this moment since she was 9 years old. Thursday morning broke over Boston like something that had been building for a long time. Mary rose at 4:30. She dressed. She retrieved the folded notebook pages from inside her bodice. She'd kept them there all night, and she smoothed them flat and refolded them carefully, and placed them inside her left sleeve against her wrist, held there by the cuff button she'd sewn tight 3 days ago, specifically for this purpose. She went to work. She pressed 2 gowns. She completed the linen inventory. She ate her breakfast in the servants' hall with her hands steady around her cup and her eyes on the middle distance, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest that she was choosing to call readiness rather than fear. At 9:30, the federal inquiry officers arrived. 2 of them, not soldiers, not sheriff's men, but federal document officers in plain coats with the particular bearing of men who did this regularly and found it unremarkable. They arrived at the front entrance, which was itself a statement, and they were received by Mrs. Plum, who received them with the expression of a woman receiving a dentist. Jonathan appeared from the study corridor within minutes. He moved faster than Mary had ever seen him move, the careful ease entirely gone, replaced by something that showed her for the first time what was underneath all that constructed pleasantness. Urgency. Panic, even controlled, dressed up but there. "This is highly irregular," he said to the officers. "I'll need to contact our family solicitor before any documents are—" "Mr. Graves." The lead officer, a lean, gray-haired man with a Boston accent and the patience of someone who had heard this exact sentence many times before, looked at him levelly. "The notification was served 48 hours ago. The inquiry proceeds on schedule." "I understand that, but the nature of charitable accounts requires—" "Mr. Graves." Jonathan closed his mouth. The officers moved toward the study corridor. Jonathan turned, and his eyes swept the hallway. The servants gathered at the periphery, as servants always were when something was happening present and invisible simultaneously, and his gaze landed on Mary. She was holding a pressed tablecloth. She met his eyes and held them, and did not look away, and did not change her expression by a single degree. His jaw tightened. He looked away first. Hawthorne arrived at 10 o'clock. He came through the front entrance the same way he'd stood in the grand hall, without announcement, without performance, simply present. He wore the same severe dark coat. He carried a leather document case. He looked like a man who had come to do a specific thing and intended to do it. He didn't look at Mary when he came in. She understood why. She was glad of it. He spoke briefly with the document officers in the corridor outside the study, low enough that she couldn't hear the words. Only the cadence-efficient directive, with none of the social pleasantries that preceded most conversations in this house. Eleanor appeared at the top of the main staircase at 10:10. She came down slowly, not dramatically, not with the sharp energy that Jonathan had shown. Eleanor descended with the same pace she always had in a dark morning dress. Her hair immaculate, her expression carrying the polished, sorrowful dignity of a woman who is deeply pained to find her charitable work being subjected to this kind of scrutiny. "Judge Hawthorne," she said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "I must say I'm surprised. I thought we'd spoken clearly at the ball." "We spoke briefly," he said. "This is a formal inquiry." "Of course." She glanced at the document officers. "I do hope this won't take long. The quarterly charity committee meets on Friday, and there are a great many people depending on Mrs. Graves." He said, "I'd like to begin with the Federal Relief Society disbursement accounts from the last 3 years. Eleanor looked at him. "Naturally," she said. "Though I should tell you that our accounts are impeccably maintained. We've never had so much as the accounts, Mrs. Graves." Something moved through the hallway. Not a sound more, the absence of sound, the held breath quality of a room adjusting to a new gravitational center. Eleanor turned toward the study. "If you'll follow me." The next 2 hours were the strangest of Mary's life. She worked. She pressed a tablecloth and refolded the linen inventory and carried 2 trunks from the upper corridor to the storage room and went about the ordinary morning mechanics of the household as though nothing unusual was happening. As though federal officers weren't moving through the study 40 feet away, as though she wasn't carrying evidence against this household pressed flat against her wrist under her cuff. At noon, Jonathan came to find her. He didn't come to the pressing room this time. He came to the servants' corridor, the back passage between the laundry and the linen storage, narrow and dim, and the part of the house where people like Jonathan Graves almost never went, because it was the part of the house where the actual work happened. He looked wrong there. Too large, too well-dressed. A man out of his element in the way that made him more dangerous, not less. "Give it to me," he said. No preamble, no pleasantries. The velvet was entirely gone. Mary looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" "The ledger. Whatever you took. I know you were in the study." His voice was low and even, and she could hear underneath the evenness the thing he was keeping leashed. "Give it to me right now, and this ends quietly. You keep your position. You keep your wages. We never speak of this again." "I don't know what you're referring to, Mr. Graves." "Don't." The word came out sharp. "Don't do that. We're past that." He stepped closer. "You think Hawthorne is going to protect you? He's a federal judge. He deals in documents and legal process. What he can't do is stand between you and the consequences of making enemies of this family. Not after the inquiry closes. Not when you're still living in this house." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Mary." His voice changed, dropped into something almost gentle, and that was the worst version of it she'd learned. The gentle version was the one that meant he'd already decided. "You're a very smart woman. You have been the entire time you've worked here. I've always respected that. Which is why I'm talking to you like this, instead of simply going to Mrs. Plum and having your belongings put in the street." A pause. "Don't make me be less reasonable than I'd like to be." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Graves," she said, "I have been working in this house for 4 years, and in 4 years I have pressed your coats and your mother's gowns and your table linens and the dresses of every woman who has come through this door for charity events and dinner parties and balls. I've done it correctly every single time. Not once have I been unreasonable." She held his gaze. "I intend to keep that record." He stared at her. Then he turned and walked away. She waited until his footsteps had faded entirely. Then she walked at her ordinary pace to the front hallway where one of the document officers was stationed, reviewing papers, and she said quietly, "I need to speak with Judge Hawthorne." The officer looked at her. "He's in the study with Mrs. Graves." "I'm aware. I need to speak with him." Something in her voice, the steadiness of it, or the particular quality of her stillness, made him pause. "I'll let him know," he said. "Miss Long." Hawthorne came out of the study 11 minutes later. He came into the side room off the main hallway, where the officer had told her to wait, and he closed the door behind him, and he looked at her face and said nothing. Waiting. She reached into her left cuff and withdrew the folded notebook pages. She laid them on the table between them. He looked down at them, then at her. "When?" he said. "3 weeks ago. I memorized what I could and copied the rest. The figures in the third column don't match the federal disbursement records by a cumulative total of." She'd run the numbers so many times in her head, she didn't need to check. $11,416, over 3 years. The room was very quiet. "That's a significant sum," he said. "It's also not the only account. There's a second set of figures at the bottom of each quarterly page, smaller, harder to track. I think they're the orphan relief disbursements. I wasn't able to cross-reference them against the public records, but—" "I have the public records," he said. He picked up the notebook pages. He read them with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, total, unhurried, missing nothing. He read them for 4 minutes without speaking. "Miss Whitlock," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "Where is the original ledger?" "Bottom drawer of the correspondence desk in the East Study, unless they've moved it since this morning." His expression didn't change. "They haven't. It's already in evidence custody." He looked at her pages again. "Your figures match what we found in the ledger." She felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise name for. Not relief exactly. Relief would come later if it came at all. This was something more immediate. Something that had been wound very tight for a very long time and had just barely begun to ease. "The step," she said. "Samuel Briggs. He'll tell you." "I've already spoken to Mr. Briggs," Hawthorne said, "this morning before I came to the house." He looked at her steadily. He was waiting outside the federal office at 8 o'clock. She hadn't known that. Something tightened in her chest, not painfully, the opposite of painfully. "He's a good man," she said. "He is." Hawthorne set her notebook pages down on the table with deliberate care. "Miss Whitlock, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. I haven't answered you any other way." The corner of his mouth moved barely. "No, you haven't." He looked at her. "Jonathan Graves spoke to you this morning." It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What did he say?" She told him. Word for word, as precisely as she could reconstruct it. Jonathan's voice in the servant corridor. The offer, the threat wrapped inside the offer. The way the gentleness at the end of it was the sharpest part. Hawthorne listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand," he said, "that what he said to you this morning constitutes attempted obstruction of a federal inquiry." "I thought it might." "Are you willing to state it formally?" "As a witness." She thought about Eleanor's face in the morning assembly. She thought about Jonathan's voice in the servant corridor. She thought about the weight of what she'd been carrying for 3 weeks against her skin, folded flat in a notebook she'd bought with a week's wages. She thought about the war widows who hadn't received their money, the orphans, the people whose names appeared in those account columns as beneficiaries, and who had instead been used as cover for a theft that had been ongoing for 3 years. She thought about herself at 9 years old in the orphanage outside Concord, being told that girls like her survived by being useful. She looked at Nathaniel Hawthorne across the small table. "Yes," she said, "I am." They arrested Jonathan Graves at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They did it in the front hallway formally with the document officers present, and the federal warrant read aloud in the clear, flat language of legal process that stripped everything theatrical away and left only the plain facts of what had been done. Jonathan said nothing when they read it. He stood very still and said nothing and looked at no one in particular, and in that stillness, Mary could see very clearly for the first time what he actually was underneath all the construction. Not a man of authority, not a man of power. A man who had believed his entire life that the architecture of his position was the same thing as the solidity of his character. He was discovering in this moment that they were not the same thing at all. Eleanor came out of the drawing room when she heard the voices in the hall. She stood at the doorway and watched them put the warrant in her son's hands, and her face went through something that Mary had never seen on it before. Not the practiced composure, not the polished sorrow, not the calibrated warmth or the cold calculation. Something underneath all of that, something raw and old and without a name that fit politely. Then it was gone. Eleanor Graves composed herself in approximately 4 seconds, which was, Mary thought, genuinely impressive. She looked across the hallway. She found Mary. And Mary looked back at her, The way she'd learned to look at things she wasn't afraid of anymore directly, steadily, without the careful blankness she'd spent 14 years constructing. Eleanor held that look for 3 seconds. Then she turned to Hawthorne. "I would like to speak with my solicitor," she said. "Of course," he said. "You'll have that opportunity. I assume you believe you have something significant here." "I believe we have everything we need, yes." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a voice entirely stripped of performance, in a voice that was just a woman in a hallway on a hot summer Thursday. "She was a seamstress." Hawthorne looked at her. "She was a seamstress," Eleanor said again, and it was hard to tell if she meant it as an explanation, or a question, or a thing she was simply trying to make sense of the fact of Mary Whitlock standing in her hallway, having undone 40 years of careful architecture, with a notebook bought on a week's wages. "She was," Hawthorne said, "a very observant one." He turned back toward the study. Jonathan was taken out through the front entrance. The summer heat came in through the open door and moved through the hallway like it owned the place, and Mary stood in it and breathed it in, and felt not triumph, not yet, not exactly, but the particular quality of air that moves through a room when something that has been sealed for a very long time is finally opened. She was still standing there when Hawthorne came back into the hallway. He stopped when he saw her. Something moved across his face, not the assessment, not the precision. Something beneath those, something she was only beginning to learn how to read. "You should sit down," he said. "Your ankle." She almost laughed. It came out smaller than a laugh, just a breath with something in it that might have been humor under different circumstances. "I've been standing on it all morning," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." He stood there for a moment. This man who had walked into a grand hall on a summer evening and looked at her when 300 other people had looked through her, and who had called what was done to her by its correct name, and who had spent a week moving pieces she couldn't see in order to be in the right position when it mattered, and he said nothing more. He didn't need to. Some things had already been said in the only language that actually counted, the language of being seen and being believed and being worth the trouble of the truth. She found a chair. She sat down. Outside the windows of Graves Estate, Boston, moved through its ordinary Thursday afternoon, entirely unaware that something had just shifted inside these walls. Carriages on the cobblestones. Voices. The distant bell of the Old North Church marking the quarter hour, and Mary Whitlock sat in a chair in the front hallway of the house she'd worked in for 4 years, with her ankle wrapped and her evidence delivered, and her hands finally still in her lap. And she breathed. She breathed. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the breathing didn't cost her anything at all. The city found out by Friday morning. Boston was not a large city in the way that mattered, not in the way that allowed secrets to travel slowly. It was a city of churches and counting houses and charity committees where the same 40 families had been managing each other's reputations for 3 generations, and news moved through it the way water moved through old pipes, fast pressurized, finding every crack. By Friday morning, people who had attended the Grand Federal Charity Ball 2 weeks ago were having breakfast conversations about Eleanor Graves with the particular energy of people who had always privately suspected something and were now being publicly validated in that suspicion. By Friday afternoon, the ministers who had praised her from their pulpits were discovering urgent reasons to qualify their previous statements. By Friday evening, the women who had copied her hats were in various drawing rooms across Beacon Hill pretending they hadn't. Mary knew none of this directly. She knew it the way she knew most things about the world she lived adjacent to, through fragments, through the conversations that happened around servants, as though servants weren't there, through the particular quality of Mrs. Plum's silence at the Saturday morning assembly, which was a different quality of silence than usual. Mrs. Plum had spent 20 years running this household. She had done it correctly. She had done it without complaint and without apparent moral opinion about the people she worked for, which was, Mary had always thought, either a remarkable achievement of professional detachment or the saddest thing she'd ever witnessed, depending on the day. On Saturday morning, Mrs. Plum looked at the assembled household staff and said, "The inquiry is ongoing. Your positions are secure for the present. Do your work." And then she looked at Mary. Just for a moment. Just a glance sideways and brief, that carried in it something Mary had never once seen on Harriet Plum's face in 4 years. Something that might in another woman have been called an apology. Then she looked away, and the assembly dismissed, and Mary went back to work. Because that was what you did, because the linens still needed pressing, and the gowns still needed starching, and the world didn't pause its ordinary requirements just because something significant had happened inside one of its houses. She was called to give her formal statement on Monday. The federal office on Court Street was a building that had always existed in the periphery of Mary's Boston. She'd walked past it countless times on her half-day off, on her way to the stationer's or the parish library, without ever once having a reason to enter it. It was a building that belonged to a different register of the city, the register where things were decided and recorded and made official, where the machinery of law and governance turned its slow and necessary gears. She went in through the front entrance. She sat across a mahogany table from 2 federal clerks and a court recorder with Hawthorne present, but seated to the side, not conducting the questioning himself. She understood because he was the presiding judge, and the protocols of the inquiry required him to maintain a specific distance from witness interviews. He sat to the side and said nothing, and she was aware of him, the way you were aware of weather, not looking at it directly, but always knowing where it was. She told them everything, all of it this time. Not the careful edited version she'd been carrying for 3 weeks. Not the strategic selection she'd made in the corridor at the ball. Not the abbreviated account she'd delivered to Hawthorne in the side room on Thursday. Everything the morning she'd seen the ledger, the figures she'd memorized the 12 minutes at the desk. 3 weeks later, the notebook pages Jonathan in the servant corridor on Thursday morning with his offer wrapped around a threat Samuel Briggs at the carriage house, the note under her door, all of it. She spoke for 40 minutes without stopping in the same even voice she'd used to say, "Yes, ma'am," for 4 years. And the court recorder's pen moved steadily across the paper, and the clerks asked their clarifying questions, and she answered them. And at the end of it, one of the clerks looked at his notes, and then at her, and said with the slightly surprised expression of a man recalibrating, "Miss Whitlock, you have an extraordinary memory." "I had good reason to use it," she said. Chatung. Samuel Briggs gave his statement the same day in a different room, and Mary didn't hear what he said, but she heard afterward from the clerk who escorted her back to the entrance that his account corroborated hers in every material detail. She had known it would, but knowing it would, and hearing that it had, were 2 different things, and she stood on the steps of the federal office on Court Street in the Monday morning heat and let herself feel that for a moment the solid anchoring fact of not being alone in this. She had spent a long time being alone in things. She was not used to how it felt to not be. Hawthorne appeared beside her. He had come out through a side entrance quietly without announcement, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world. He stood beside her on the steps and looked out at Court Street and said nothing for a moment, and she said nothing either, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't require filling. "The clerks are going to want to speak with you again," he said finally. "Later this week, most likely, when they've cross-referenced your figures against the ledger." "I'll be available," she said. "Are you still at the Graves house?" She'd been thinking about that. "For the moment. Mrs. Plum hasn't given me notice, and I need the wages until—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Yes, for now." He looked at her. Not the assessment look, something slightly different from that, something with a different quality of attention to it that she was still learning to identify. "That situation will resolve," he said. "The estate will go into federal oversight within the month. The staff will be transitioned." "Transition to what?" "That depends on the outcome of the hearing, but the household will not continue under Eleanor Graves' management." He paused. "I want you to know that your position, your financial position, is something the court is aware of. You are a material witness in a federal fraud case. There are protections." Mary looked at him. "What kind of protections?" "Practical ones," he said. "I'll make sure you understand them before the week is out." She studied his profile for a moment, the precision of it, the absence of anything decorative. "Judge Hawthorne," she said, "why did you come outside?" He was quiet for a beat. "The clerk's assessment was correct," he said. "Your memory is extraordinary. Most witnesses, even educated, prepared witnesses, have gaps, inconsistencies. You had none." He looked at her. "I wanted to tell you that." She held his gaze. "You could have had someone send a note," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, the same fraction of movement she'd seen once before in the grand hall. "I could have," he said. He didn't explain why he hadn't. He didn't need to. Eleanor Graves's hearing was set for the last Thursday of August. The intervening weeks were the strangest of Mary's life. Stranger even than the weeks of carrying the ledger, because those weeks had at least had the clarity of purpose. These weeks had a different texture. The household continued to function because households continued to function. That was what they did, regardless of what was happening to the people who owned them. But it functioned now with the particular quality of a thing waiting for its own ending. Jonathan remained in federal custody. Eleanor remained in the house. She was not confined. The charges against her were financial, not violent, and she was a woman of standing. Being given the courtesies accorded to a woman of standing, even when those courtesies were being systematically dismantled, and she moved through the rooms of Graves' estate with the same bearing she'd always had, but quieter now. Stripped of the performance somehow. Or perhaps Mary was simply seeing her differently now that the architecture of what she'd built had been exposed for what it was. They didn't speak. 3 weeks. The same house. And Eleanor Graves and Mary Whitlock moved through it without exchanging a single word, which was, Mary thought, probably the most honest thing that had ever happened between them. Mrs. Plum ran the household. Samuel Briggs drove the carriages. Mary pressed the linens. And in the evenings, when the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the candle burning low. And she read borrowed books from the parish library. The same way she'd taught herself to read in the first place. The same way she'd always done everything, which was quietly and without anyone's permission. She was reading a legal text, a dry, precise volume on federal property law that she'd had to ask the librarian to locate for her, which had produced a look of mild surprise that she'd chosen to ignore when the knock came at her door on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the inquiry had begun. It was Mrs. Plum. Mary opened the door and looked at her and waited, because in 4 years she had learned that the most useful thing you could do with Harriet Plum was wait. Mrs. Plum looked at the book in Mary's hand, looked at her face, did the internal calculation that was always happening behind those controlled eyes. "There's a letter for you," she said, "delivered to the front entrance." She held it out. "Officially, letters for staff come through the back." "Yes, ma'am." "This one came through the front." A pause. "The officer who delivered it said it was from the federal court office." Mary took the letter. Mrs. Plum didn't leave immediately. "Mary," she said, and it was the first time in 4 years, possibly the first time ever, that she'd used just the first name without the formal address. Just the name, flat and direct, the way she said everything. "What happened to that step? I should have done differently." Mary looked at her. There was a version of this moment where she said it was all right, where she smoothed it over with the reflex of 4 years of yes ma'am, where she accepted the partial acknowledgement and asked nothing more of it. She was tired of that version. "You should have," she said. "I reported it. You told me to mind where I step." Mrs. Plum absorbed that. Her jaw tightened. "Yes," she said. "I did. Nothing more. No excuse. No explanation of the pressure she'd been under, the position she'd been in, the 20 years of service that had trained her to manage problems rather than acknowledge them. Just yes. I did. It wasn't enough. Mary knew it wasn't enough, and Mrs. Plum knew it wasn't enough, and they stood there for a moment in the doorway with that knowledge between them. "Good night, Mrs. Plum," Mary said. "Good night," Mrs. Plum said. She left. Mary closed the door and opened the letter. It was not from the court office. It was from Hawthorne. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the same precise angular script as the 4-word note she'd burned over a candle. This letter was longer. 2 pages written in the same handwriting, but with something slightly different in the construction of it, less formal than she'd expected, less official. More direct, in the way that direct sometimes looked like something else entirely, when you weren't braced for it. He wrote that the cross-referencing of her figures with the original ledger was complete, and that the discrepancy was confirmed at $11,416 over 3 years, plus an additional $4,200 in orphan relief accounts she'd identified correctly, but hadn't been able to fully calculate from her copied figures. He wrote that Samuel Briggs' testimony about the staircase had been formally entered into evidence corroborated by the carpenter who had originally assessed the step 3 months prior and recommended repair, and whose recommendation had never been acted on. He wrote that Eleanor Graves's solicitor had entered a plea of accounting error which he described in 3 words as entirely without merit. And then, at the bottom of the 2nd page, in the same handwriting, but with a quality to it that was different from the legal summary above, he wrote, "You asked me once why I came to the ball. The truth is, I nearly didn't. Federal business had kept me 3 hours later than I'd intended, and I was tired, and it seemed like an obligation rather than a necessity. I came in through the east entrance at 9:30, and I saw you before I saw anyone else in that room. I don't know that I can explain precisely why. I think perhaps it is because I have spent a great deal of my professional life learning to look for the things that are being hidden. And you were the most visible hidden thing in that room. I wanted you to know that what you did, carrying that knowledge for 3 weeks, copying those figures, keeping your own counsel until you had someone to bring it to, was not small. It was not the ordinary courage of an ordinary situation. It is the kind of thing that most people never manage, regardless of education, position, or advantage. The hearing is Thursday. You will be asked to speak. I believe you are ready." She read it twice. Then she set it down on her knee and sat there in the narrow room with the candle burning, and she felt something move through her that she hadn't felt in long enough that she'd almost forgotten it was something she was capable of feeling. Not gratitude. Something bigger than that and harder to name. The feeling of being accurately seen by someone who had no reason to look carefully and having chosen to look anyway. She folded the letter. She put it inside the legal text on federal property law between pages 42 and 43. She blew out the candle. She did not sleep for a long time, but it was not the sleeplessness of fear. It was something else entirely. The hearing convened on a Thursday morning in the last week of August. The Federal Circuit Courtroom on Court Street was a room built to communicate authority through proportion-high ceilings, long benches, the kind of deliberate gravity that reminded everyone present that what happened in here had weight that extended beyond the room itself. Mary had never been inside it before. She had walked past its exterior 100 times without imagining she would ever have cause to enter. She sat in the witness section with her hands folded in her lap and her ankles still faintly sore, still a reminder pressed flat to the floor, and she watched the room fill. The people who came surprised her. She had expected officials, lawyers, the machinery of legal process populated by the kind of men who operated it. And those were there, Hawthorne at the center bench, the federal attorneys, the clerks, Eleanor's solicitor with his leather case, and his prepared expressions of righteous indignation. But there were also others, war widows, 3 of them seated in the public gallery. Women in plain dresses, with the specific bearing of people who had been managing on insufficient resources for long enough that it had become structural visible in the way they held themselves. Mary didn't know who had told them. She didn't know how they'd found out that the money they were supposed to have received had been systematically redirected for 3 years. But they were there, and they sat in the public gallery, with their hands in their laps and their eyes on the front of the room, and their presence in that space said everything that needed saying about what was actually at stake. One of them caught Mary's eye. She was perhaps 50, gray-haired, tired in the deep way of someone who'd been tired for years, and she looked at Mary the way you looked at someone you recognized from a description, and she nodded. Just once. Small direct. Mary nodded back. Eleanor came in with her solicitor at 9 o'clock, and took her seat at the respondent's table, and she did not look at Mary. The solicitor's opening argument lasted 20 minutes and was, in Mary's assessment, a work of considerable technical skill applied to an impossible task. He spoke about the complexity of charitable account management, the honest mistakes inherent in large-scale disbursement operations, the 30-year reputation of Eleanor Graves as a woman of unimpeachable philanthropic commitment, the nature of accounting discrepancies in the federal period's less standardized record-keeping environment. He did not mention Jonathan. He did not mention the staircase. He spoke for 20 minutes, and when he finished, the federal attorney stood and said very briefly that he'd be entering 112 pages of documentary evidence into the record and calling 4 witnesses, and he sat back down. 112 pages. Eleanor's solicitor absorbed this without visible reaction. Eleanor herself was looking at the surface of the respondent's table. Not reading anything, not taking notes. Just looking at the surface of it, in the way you looked at things when what you were actually doing was trying to stay somewhere specific inside yourself. Hawthorne managed the proceedings with the same quality he brought to everything: total precision, no excess. He didn't perform authority, he simply had it in the way certain people had things that were simply true about them. He looked at Mary once briefly when the first witness was sworn in. She held the look for a moment. Then they both looked away and turned their attention back to what needed to be done. Samuel Briggs testified for 35 minutes. He sat in the witness chair with his hat on his knee and his hand still, and he told the court exactly what he'd told Mary at the carriage house. Jonathan's instructions, the loosened bracket, the carpenter who never came back. He told it in his plain, careful way, without embellishment and without hesitation. And when Eleanor's solicitor cross-examined him and suggested that his memory of a routine maintenance request 2 months prior might be imperfect, Samuel looked at the man with the patience of someone who had been called a liar before and had simply outlasted the accusation. "I've worked in that house for 23 years, he said. "I remember every instruction Mr. Jonathan gave me in that time. That particular one I remember better than most, because I knew when the carpenter didn't come back what it meant, and I didn't say so. That's something I'll carry. But it don't change what I remember." The solicitor had nothing further. Samuel walked back to his seat, and as he passed Mary, he didn't look at her, but his chin lifted slightly, and she understood. She was next. She walked to the witness chair without the cane. She'd made that decision deliberately 3 days ago, and had been quietly practicing on the ankle that was almost not quite, but almost healed. She didn't want to walk into that chair looking injured, not because she was ashamed of the injury, because she needed the room to see what she actually was, rather than what had been done to her. The federal attorney asked his questions in a precise sequence. The ledger, the figures, the 12 minutes at the desk, the notebook pages, the conversation with Jonathan in the servant corridor. All of it in the order that built the clearest possible architecture of what had happened, and how she knew it. She answered everything. Her voice did not waver. She watched Eleanor Graves's face during her testimony. Not pointedly, not confrontationally, but because she had spent 4 years watching Eleanor's face, and she understood its grammar, and she wanted to know what Eleanor actually thought of what was being said about her in this room. Eleanor was looking at the table again, until she wasn't. About 20 minutes into Mary's testimony, when the federal attorney was walking her through the specific discrepancies between the copied ledger figures and the public charitable accounts line by line with the original ledger open in front of the court. For comparison, Eleanor looked up, and she looked at Mary. Not with the erasure, not with the management, not with any of the expressions Mary had cataloged over 4 years. With something underneath all of those things. Something that looked stripped of everything else, like the face of a woman who had made a choice and was finally irreversibly reckoning with the cost of it. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then Eleanor looked back at the table. Eleanor's solicitor cross-examined Mary for 40 minutes, and it was the most rigorous 40 minutes of her life. Questions about her literacy, her access, her motives, her relationship with Hawthorne, her knowledge of accounting, her ability to accurately reproduce figures from a single viewing 3 weeks prior. He was thorough. He was skilled. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do. None of it moved her. Not because she wasn't afraid she was underneath the steadiness, in the way she'd been afraid since the morning she'd seen that ledger and understood what she was looking at. But fear and steadiness were not incompatible. She'd learned that 4 years ago, pressing someone else's gowns with hands that ached from the cold. When the solicitor had finished, Hawthorne looked at him and said, "Are you done with this witness?" "Yes, Your Honor." Hawthorne looked at Mary. "Miss Whitlock," he said. Just her name in the same tone he used for everything level precise, giving nothing away. "Is there anything you wish to add to your testimony? Anything you believe the court should hear that has not been asked of you?" The room was very still. She had not expected the question. It was not standard procedure. She knew enough about legal process to know that. He was giving her something. A door left open. She thought about 3 weeks of carrying folded paper against her skin. She thought about the war widow in the gallery, who had nodded at her once without ceremony. She thought about what it meant to stand in a room where the truth was finally being allowed to take up its full amount of space. She looked at the court, the attorneys, the clerks, the gallery, the war widows in their plain dresses, Mrs. Plum, who had come in and taken a seat in the back row without telling anyone she was coming. She looked at Hawthorne last. "Yes," she said. "There is." She turned back to the room. "I was not silent because I was weak," she said. Her voice was steady. Completely steady. The way things were steady when they'd been tested enough times that steadiness was just what they were. "I was silent because I had been taught that silence was safer than truth for a person in my position. I want the court to understand that. Because I am not the only person in this city who has been taught that lesson. And I think some consideration ought to be given to what it costs. What it has cost all the people who learned it alongside me, and who are not sitting in this chair today because they didn't have the particular combination of circumstances that made it possible for me to be here." She stopped. The room held it. Hawthorne looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Miss Whitlock," he said. "You may step down." She walked back to her seat. Behind her in the gallery, one of the war widows began to cry quietly, without making a scene of it, in the way women cried when they had spent a long time not being able to. Mary sat down and folded her hands in her lap and looked straight ahead, and let the sound of it exist in the room without trying to manage it or contain it or make it smaller than it was. Some things needed their full size. She was beginning to understand that. The verdict came on a Friday. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of theatrical weight that the preceding weeks might have suggested. Hawthorne read it into the court record at 9 o'clock in the morning in the same level voice he used for everything, and the words fell into the room with the quiet finality of something that had been true for a long time and was only now being officially confirmed. Eleanor Graves was found liable on 14 counts of charitable fund misappropriation, totaling $15,616 across 3 fiscal years. The Federal Relief Society accounts were frozen pending redistribution. The Graves estate was placed under federal oversight, its assets to be assessed against the outstanding debt owed to the War Widow Fund, the Orphan Relief accounts, and the Federal Relief Society's general charitable disbursements. Jonathan Graves faced separate criminal proceedings on charges of obstruction of a federal inquiry and deliberate property endangerment. The staircase formally classified now as an engineered hazard, which would be heard before the end of the year. Eleanor said nothing when it was read. She sat at the respondent's table, with her hands folded and her back straight, and her face in that stripped, quiet expression Mary had first seen in the front hallway on the day of Jonathan's arrest. And she absorbed every word of it, the way old stone absorbed weather, without visible reaction, but changed by it all the same. Her solicitor made a brief formal statement of intent to appeal. Hawthorne noted it for the record and moved on. It was over in 11 minutes. Mary sat in the witness section and listened to those 11 minutes, and felt something she hadn't fully anticipated. Not the clean, explosive relief she might have imagined, but something slower and more complicated. The feeling of a weight being set down that you'd been carrying so long, you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your own body. It took a moment to understand what to do with your hands when they were empty. The three war widows were waiting on the courthouse steps when Mary came out. She hadn't expected that either. She had expected to come out onto Court Street and find the ordinary Tuesday, she corrected herself. It was a Friday. The ordinary Friday morning of a city conducting its business. And instead she found three women standing in the late August heat, with the particular stillness of people who had been waiting a long time for something and weren't sure yet how to stand now that the waiting was over. The gray-haired one who had nodded at her in the gallery stepped forward. "Miss Whitlock," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The woman looked at her for a moment, studied her really with the kind of attention that wasn't scrutiny so much as recognition. The recognition of one person who'd had to be very careful for a very long time looking at another. "My name is Catherine Marsh," she said. "My husband died at the Siege of York 2 years ago. The relief fund money, what we should have received, it would have kept my daughter in school another year." She paused. "I just wanted you to know what you did, what it means for us." Mary looked at her. She had thought about this moment, had thought about it in the abstract in the way you thought about consequences when you were in the middle of a decision and trying to understand its full weight. She had thought about war widows as a category, as the people those account numbers represented, as the human reality behind the figures she'd memorized and copied and delivered to a federal inquiry. Standing in front of Catherine Marsh, she understood that she hadn't been thinking about them at all. Not really. She'd been thinking about numbers, about justice as a system, as a mechanism, as a process that could be initiated and completed. She hadn't been thinking about a daughter who'd left school a year early. "I'm sorry," Mary said, "for what was taken from you, and for how long it took to come to light." Catherine Marsh shook her head. "You came forward when you could," she said. "That's not nothing. That's everything, in fact." The other two women didn't speak, but they were looking at her, and she looked back at them, and there was something in that exchange that she didn't have words for, a kind of recognition that moved in both directions at once. Then the courthouse door opened behind her, and Hawthorne came out, and the moment shifted. "Shh!" He stopped when he saw the women on the steps. He looked at them, and then at Mary, and he read the scene with the accuracy she'd come to expect from him. He addressed Catherine Marsh directly. "Mrs. Marsh, the redistribution of the frozen accounts will begin within 60 days. You'll receive formal notification at your registered address." "Thank you, Judge," she said. "The full amount owed to each recipient will be calculated with interest at the federal rate." He said it plainly without performance, as though it were simply the correct next step, which it was. "I want you to know the court is aware that interest does not compensate for 2 years of absence, but it's what the law provides." Catherine Marsh looked at him steadily. "The law providing anything at all is more than we had a month ago," she said. "We'll take it." She nodded to Mary once more, and then the three women moved down the steps together, and Mary watched them go with the feeling of something settling into its proper place. Not perfectly, not without damage, but into the right configuration after a long time in the wrong one. "Miss Whitlock," she turned. Hawthorne was standing 2 steps above her, which put them at approximately the same height, which she suspected was not an accident. "Are you all right?" he said. It was the first time he'd asked her that. In all of it, the ball, the corridor, the side room, the letter, the courthouse, he had never once asked her that. He had asked what happened, and what she'd seen, and what she was willing to say, and whether she was ready, but he hadn't asked that. She considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think I might need a few days to find out." He looked at her. "That's a reasonable answer. I have a lot of those." The corner of his mouth, that fraction of movement she'd catalogued now across 3 months of watching his face. "You do," he said. "It's one of the more useful things about you." She looked at him. This man who had walked into a grand hall and looked at her when everyone else had looked through her, who had spent 3 weeks moving pieces she couldn't see, and written her 2 pages in handwriting that was different when it wasn't being official, who had opened a door in a courtroom and let her say the thing that needed saying. "What happens now?" she said. "To me specifically." Not the case. Me. He was quiet for a moment. That depends on what you want, he said. I don't know what I'm allowed to want. That, he said, is exactly the kind of sentence I'd like you to stop saying. She stared at him. He held her gaze and didn't look away, and didn't explain himself further, and after a moment she understood that he wasn't going to. That he'd said what he meant, and was waiting for her to receive it, rather than deflect it, or qualify it, or fit it into one of the smaller containers she'd been keeping things in for 14 years. She took a breath. All right, she said. Then I'll think about it. She left the Graves house that same afternoon. She hadn't planned to do it that day, had imagined it happening gradually over the weeks of federal transition with proper notice and proper arrangements, and the careful logistics of a person who had always had to plan carefully because there was no margin for error. But she came back from the courthouse and went up to her room and stood in the doorway of it, and she looked at the narrow bed and the stub of candle and the borrowed legal text on federal property law with Hawthorne's letter inside it between pages 42 and 43, and she knew that she wasn't going to sleep in that room again. Not because it was beneath her. She'd never been the kind of person who thought in those terms, because she was finished with it. Because 4 years of this room had been what they'd needed to be, and that was over now, and the person she was on the other side of what had happened in the last 3 months did not belong in this particular space anymore. She packed what she owned into 2 bags. It didn't take long. She'd never owned much, and she came downstairs with the bags in her hands and found Mrs. Plum in the corridor. Mrs. Plum looked at the bags, looked at Mary's face, did the calculation. I'll have your final wages ready within the hour, she said. Thank you. A pause. The reference letter, Mrs. Plum said. I'd like to write you one, if you'll allow it. Mary looked at her. From you personally, she said, not from the household. Mrs. Plum absorbed that. Yes, she said, from me personally. Then I'll allow it, Mary said. She waited in the front hallway, not the servants' corridor, the front hallway, while Mrs. Plum prepared the wages and the letter. She stood there with her 2 bags and looked at the main staircase at the 3rd step from the bottom, which was still broken, still cordoned with a piece of cord someone had tied across it at some point, after the inquiry began an orange ribbon against the dark wood that looked almost cheerful in the afternoon light. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her bags and walked out through the front entrance, and she didn't look back. She found a room on Newbury Street 2 blocks from the parish library, with a window that faced east and landlady named Agnes Holt, who was 64 years old and entirely uninterested in Mary's history beyond whether she could pay the first month's rent. She could. Barely. But she could. She paid it, and she put her 2 bags down in the room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, wider than the one at Graves, with a quilt on it that someone had made by hand imperfectly in mismatched colors that were somehow better for being imperfect, and she sat there in the quiet of a space that was hers and nobody else's, and let the silence be whatever it needed to be. It was, she discovered, a very different kind of silence from the one at Graves' estate. That silence had been the kind that cost something to maintain. This one was free. The letter came 10 days later. Not from Hawthorne this time. From the Federal Reform Archive Office, a new institution formally constituted in the wake of several cases that had moved through Hawthorne's court in the past year, dedicated to the documentation of cases involving public charitable fraud and the witnesses and communities affected by them. The letter was written in official language, which she read through twice to extract the actual meaning, which was this: the Federal Reform Archive was establishing a witness testimony record for the Graves case to be maintained as a permanent public document, and they were requesting her formal participation in the construction of that record. Not just her testimony from the hearing. Her account, the full account, from the morning she'd seen the ledger to the moment the verdict was read. In her own words. In her own handwriting. A permanent public document. She set the letter down on the table by the east-facing window, and she looked at it for a long time. She thought about being 9 years old in Concord, and being told that girls like her survived by being useful and caused trouble by wanting more. She thought about 14 years of making herself small. She thought about 300 people in a grand hall choosing not to hear a whisper. She thought about 12 minutes at a desk and a notebook bought on a week's wages, and a note burned over a candle stub, and a man who had looked at her when everyone else had looked through her. She picked up her pen. She wrote back the same day, yes. She was 3 weeks into writing the archive account when Hawthorne appeared at her door on a Thursday evening. Agnes Holt showed him up with the efficient neutrality of a woman who had seen a great many things in 64 years and had opinions about most of them, but kept them largely to herself. Mary heard his footsteps on the stairs and knew them. She had memorized the precise quality of that particular way of moving through a space unhurried and entirely certain of its own direction, and she was standing when he knocked. She opened the door. He was in his ordinary coat. Not the formal court attire, just the dark coat he apparently wore when he was moving through the city rather than presiding over it. And he was holding his hat in his hand, which was the first time she'd ever seen him. With his hat in his hand, and it changed his face slightly, made it fractionally less guarded, the way removing any one layer of the official did. "Judge Hawthorne," she said. "Miss Whitlock." He looked past her at the room at the east window. The quilt, the table with her papers spread across it, the 2 bags she still hadn't fully unpacked because she was still in the process of understanding that she was allowed to stay. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. He came in and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the papers on the table, the archive account pages of her small, precise handwriting laid out in the order she'd been assembling them. "How far along are you?" he said. "The hearing. I'm writing the hearing." He nodded. "The archive director tells me you're writing it from the beginning," he said. "Not just from the ball. From the orphanage." He asked for the full account. He did. A pause. Are you all right with that? Writing all of it?" She considered it. "It was my life," she said. "It happened. Writing it down doesn't make it more true than it already is. It just makes it permanent." She looked at him. "I think I want it to be permanent." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd been learning the grammar of for 3 months. Not the assessment, not the precision. The thing beneath those, the thing that was more about what he was trying not to say than what he was saying. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about the case." She felt her attention sharpen. "What about it?" "The appeal was filed yesterday. Eleanor's solicitor is challenging the methodology of the evidence collection. Specifically," he paused, "specifically the legality of your original access to the ledger, whether you had authorized presence in the study that evening." Mary felt something cold move through her. "I was sent to collect a coat," she said. "It's in the record." "It is, and the court will uphold it. The collection task is documented in the household log." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know because I don't want you to hear it from someone else and think it's more precarious than it is. It isn't. The case is solid. But it has to be defended again." "Yes." She breathed through that. "Let it settle." "All right," she said. He looked at her. "That's it. All right. What else would you like me to say?" "Most people," he said, "would say something considerably more than all right." "I'm not most people," she said. "I've been not most people my entire life. I've just recently started to think that might be all right." Something moved across his face. Warmer than the fraction of a smile. Wider. "Yes," he said. "It is." He didn't leave immediately after that. He sat in the chair by the window, the one chair in the room which she gave him, and perched herself on the edge of the table with her papers, and they talked for 2 hours about the archive account, and the case, and the war widows, and what the Federal Reform Archive was intended to become, and what it might mean over time for the people who had no solicitors, and no family names, and no one to speak for them in the rooms where things were decided. He had opinions about all of it. Not performed opinions, actual ones held with the same quality of conviction he brought to everything direct and undecorated. She had opinions too. She said them. He listened to them the way he listened to everything she said fully, without waiting for his turn to speak without the slightly glazed patience of a man tolerating a woman's perspective until it was polite to move on. He actually listened. He turned her ideas over and engaged with them and pushed back on two of them with specific substantive counter-arguments that made her push back on his counter-arguments. And by the time Agnes Holt called up the stairs, that it was 8:30, they had disagreed productively on 3 separate points and reached a tentative agreement on a 4th, and Mary couldn't remember the last time she'd had a conversation like that. She wasn't sure she'd ever had a conversation like that. He put on his hat at the door. "The archive director wants the account complete by November," he said. "I know, I'll have it done." He looked at her, that look, the one she'd been learning. "After November," he said carefully, with the precision of a man choosing each word as though it were going to be entered into a permanent record. "I would like to continue these conversations, if that's agreeable to you." She looked back at him. "These specific conversations," she said, "or conversations in general, the fraction of a smile. I'll leave the scope open for negotiation." "That," she said, "is the most diplomatic thing I've ever heard you say." "I'm capable of it occasionally. I'll keep that in mind." He left. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment in the quiet of her own room, the room with the east window and the imperfect quilt and the table covered in the pages of her own story being written in her own hand, and she breathed. The appeal was dismissed in October. The case held. All 14 counts, all $15,600, all the documentation, all the testimony it held. Jonathan's criminal proceedings were set for December. The war widow redistribution began in the first week of November on schedule. Catherine Marsh sent her a letter. It was short, 3 sentences in handwriting that had the careful quality of someone who didn't write often and meant every word. She said the money had arrived. She said her daughter was going back to school in January. She said she was grateful. Mary read it 4 times. Then she folded it and put it inside the archive account between the pages, describing the morning she'd seen the ledger and the pages, describing the 12 minutes at the desk, which was where it belonged, right at the center of the reason why any of it had mattered. She finished the archive account on the last day of October. She delivered it to the Federal Reform Archive office on Court Street on a cold, clear November morning, with the kind of sky over Boston that made everything look very precise. Sharp edges, strong light, no ambiguity about where one thing ended and another began. The archive director was a quiet, careful man named Henderson, who received the manuscript with the professional reverence of someone who understood what documents meant, what it meant for something to be permanent to exist in the record, in a way that couldn't be erased or qualified or quietly moved to a different column. He looked at the title page. Mary had written it simply, "A True Account of the Federal Relief Society. Fraud of 1814, as witnessed and documented by Mary Whitlock, seamstress of Boston." "This will be the first entry in the witness testimony collection," Henderson said. "I know," she said. "I'd like it to not be the last." He looked at her. "I don't think it will be." Hawthorne was waiting outside when she came out. She wasn't surprised. She had been not surprised by him for months now, had adjusted to the specific reality of a person who did what he said and appeared where he indicated he would, and turned out consistently to be exactly what he presented himself as. It was a quality she'd encountered so rarely in her life that she was still sometimes recalibrating around it. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He fell into step beside her, not in front of her, not slightly behind, in the way men walked with women they considered subordinate, but beside her at the same pace, taking up the same amount of the sidewalk. "Henderson will have it cataloged by the end of the week," he said. "He told me. It'll be available for public review within the month." "I know." He glanced at her. "You don't seem particularly—" "I feel it," she said. "I just feel it quietly. I've always felt things quietly. It doesn't mean they're not there." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." They walked another half-block in silence. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mary," she said. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other on a November sidewalk in Boston, with the cold light coming down hard and clear, and there were carriages on the street, and voices, and the ordinary machinery of a city going about its Friday morning, and none of it was particularly aware of the two people standing on the sidewalk in the middle of it, which was fine. She was done needing the room to be aware of her. She knew what she was now. She had written it down in 140 pages and put it in a permanent record, and she knew the precise weight and shape of it, and she no longer needed anyone to confirm it for her. "Mary," he said, and it was the first time he'd said it, just her name, plain the way she'd said it to him. It sounded different in his voice, more solid, more like something that had always been true. "Yes," she said. "I would like—" He stopped, started again, and she watched him do it, this precise, controlled man, finding his way through something that his precision didn't have a protocol for. "I would like for us to have more conversations, on a basis that is not strictly related to federal proceedings." She looked at him. "I'd like that too," she said. He nodded once, the same small certain nod she'd seen him give in courtrooms when something was confirmed and the next thing could proceed. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They kept walking. Boston moved around them, noisy and cold and indifferent and entirely unaware. And Mary Whitlock walked through it with her head up and her step even, and the permanent record of her own name in a federal archive behind her, and the particular quality of morning light on her face. And she was not small, and she was not hidden, and she was not afraid of being remembered. She was, in fact, certain of it, and that certainty earned through 14 years of silence and 3 months of truth, and one November morning on a sidewalk in Boston was hers. Completely and permanently hers. No one was ever going to take it back.